February 7th, 1971, Master of Reality, writing and recording. The lineup on Master of Reality was Ozzy Osbourne on vocals, Tony Iommi on guitar, Geezer Butler on bass, and Bill Ward on drums. And on the production and engineering side, it was once again produced by Roger Bain. It was recorded at Island Studios in London between February and April of 1971. Now, there are some writing credits on this album where tracks 1, 4, 6, 7, and 8 were written by Iommi, Butler, Ward, and Osbourne collectively, and tracks 2, 3, and 5 were just credited to Tony Iommi. The track list on this record is Sweet Leaf, After Forever / The Elegy, Embryo, Children of the Grave / The Haunting, Orchid, Lord of This World, Solitude, Into the Void, and Death Mask. The album has 8 tracks over 34 minutes and 29 seconds. Now, the first recording session would take place between the 7th and 15th of February 1971 in the middle of the band's tour for Paranoid, and then again between the 6th and 13th of April of 1971, this time around giving the band almost 3 full months to record the album. Now, in addition to having a bit more time in the studio, they also went from having 8 tracks to record to a true multi-16 track layout, which meant that they could do more overdubs and experiment with their sound a little more, which drummer Bill Ward explains, quote, "Previously, we didn't have a clue what to do in the studio and relied heavily on Roger, but this time we were a lot more together, understood what was involved, and were more opinionated on how things should be done."
But Massive Reality was quite a different thing. That took a lot longer. That's when we started getting into long time for us. It was going into weeks, and oh God, this is taking a bit long. We tried. There was one particular track that Bill couldn't get right. I think it was Under the Sun or something it was called. And we went to about 3 or 4 different studios because couldn't get the vibe in them days. I don't know how we got to that, but
So the band went into Island Studios, and that is where post-production was carried out for the Paranoid record. And the band worked with, for the last time, the same producers on their first 2 records, which were Roger Bain and Tom Allom. The reason for this is because Tony Iommi wanted to be a little bit more hands-on with the band's sound and would take over production for the next several albums. Now, the first song the band recorded during this time was the track After Forever. And in the liner notes of the 1998 live album Reunion, drummer Bill Ward has said this about the Master of Reality record, saying that it was, quote, an exploratory album. He says on the first album, we had 2 days to do everything and not much more time for Paranoid. But now we could take our time and try out different things, so we all embraced the opportunity. Tony threw in some classical guitar parts. Geezer's bass was virtually doubled in power, and I went for bigger bass drums and also experimented with overdubs. And Ozzy was so much better, but this was the first time when we didn't have gigs booked in, and I could just focus on making the album a landmark. And another really interesting thing about this record, this was another turning point from the band. They mentioned experimenting, and so on the tracks Children of the Grave, Lord of This World, and Into the Void, Iommi downtuned his guitar 1.5 steps in effort to reduce string tension, making the guitar less painful for him to play. So on those tracks, Tony's guitar is played in C-sharp standard tuning, with the exception of After Forever and Solitude. Those are just tuned down 1 whole step to D standard. This change would inspire bands to do the same thing over the following decades, shaping the soundscape of the metal genre to the point where at the time of this recording, if you look at the modern era of bands, most of them, if not all, down-tuned to some insanely low tunings. And it all goes back to Black Sabbath. Now, in an interview talking about those tunings, Tony has said, quote, "It was a part of an experiment, tuning down together for a bigger, heavier sound. Back then, all the other bands had rhythm guitarists or keyboards, but we made do with guitar, bass guitar, and drums. So we tried to make them sound as fat as possible. Tuning down just seemed to give more depth to it. I think I was the first one to do that."
I went to approach different companies to make me like those strings. They said, it can't be done, it's impossible. It wouldn't be harmonically right. So I said, it can be done. I've done it. I've dropped all the strings down and made sets up from banjo strings and whatnot. And it worked for me, and I could bend them, and it was good. I got fed up of hearing all this rubbish, so I went to John Birch and asked him if he'd, and we got involved together, and I put the money up for him to start the company, to start making guitars of 24 frets, and this was the first one here. And then we started experimenting with pickups and making pickups and different designs, which was the ones that's on there now. It was some of the first pickups we'd done. But I'd try them on the guitar, on my old Gibson first, and try them on gigs till I found the one that sounded right, and then I'd say, this is the one, and he'd make a couple the same, and then that would be it. And then JD, John Diggins, who used to work for John Birch, now is in charge of his own company, who did come on the road with me and do my guitars. He now got his own guitar company, and he now does my stuff, and he made these pickups for me here, which I really like. And again, I can work with him like I did with John Birch. A lot of the big guitar companies don't seem to, or didn't seem to want to know then, although they may want to know now, but I think they threw a lot away by not listening. Hence the 24 frets and even locking nuts and stuff we were getting into many years ago before these companies would, give it a thought.
And speaking on that toning down, Geezer Butler has stated that he also downtuned his bass guitar to match Iommi, saying, quote, "It helped with the sound too. And then it got to the point where we tuned even lower to make it easier vocal-wise, but Ozzy would then sing it higher, so it sort of defeated the object." And like we mentioned earlier with Bill Ward trying to try some new stuff on the record, he says, quote, "I was pulling off a lot of new things that I've been trying to do for like 3 years, such as my double bass work in the track Children of the Grave. There's a lot of different bass drum movement, and I play the timbal with my left hand on that song too." Now, in Ozzy's autobiography, I Am Ozzy, he says that he can't really remember much about the recording of Master Reality, apart from the fact that Tony had detuned his guitar to make it easier to play. Geezer wrote Sweet Leaf about all the dope we'd been smoking, and Children of the Grave was the most kick-ass song we'd ever recorded. So let's take a look at some of these standout tracks on this record, starting with Sweet Leaf. Now, during the album's recording sessions, Osborne brought Iommi a large joint, which caused the guitarist to cough uncontrollably. Iommi was actually recording acoustic guitar parts at this time, and his coughing fit was actually captured on tape. So a fragment of that coughing from Iommi was later added by producer Bain as the intro to Sweet Leaf, a song that was very much admittedly an ode to marijuana. Iommi had recalled saying, quote, "We all played Sweet Leaf while stoned," with Butler recalling in his own saying, quote, "I do remember writing Sweet Leaf in the studio. I'd just come back from Dublin and they had these cigarettes called Sweet Afton, which you could only get in Ireland. We were going, what could we write about? And I took out the cigarette packet, and as you opened it, it's got this lid saying, 'It's the sweetest leaf that gives you the taste.' And I was like, Sweet Leaf." Now, there is some debate about this story, as apparently the slogan for Sweet Afton doesn't actually say that, and it's attributed to an Ogden cigarette. Now, despite the band indulging in the Sweet Leaf, the band hadn't fully given into all the vices that would come later in their career, as Bill Ward explains, saying, quote, "I won't pretend there wasn't alcohol and drugs around, because we were getting into those sort of things. But back then, we still had control over those habits. I could keep my drinking and drugging right down in the studio so it didn't affect my playing. I could have a drink at the pub and know when to stop. This only became an issue a few years on. Making the third album was more important than getting out of our heads." And Children of the Grave. This song is somewhat of a spiritual successor to War Pigs. The song further pushes the sentiment about the Vietnam War and the soldiers who were coming home scarred and disfigured. To which Bill Ward says, quote, "We had a lot of veteran soldiers turning up in wheelchairs at shows, and they'd come down to the front for this song, as they did for War Pigs, waving their flags and singing along. It made for a very emotional and wild time." And the song After Forever. So this song finally took a stance against all the early stages of the band where they were accused of being Satanist and evil, and took a more philosophical view at Christianity, to which Bill Ward has said, quote, "What we were doing on After Forever was asking relevant questions about the validity of Christianity, in particular Catholicism. We were voicing our own inner concerns about it all, asking everyone if they were prepared to accept what was being said without questioning whether this was right or wrong." And he continues on saying, "Previously, we discussed the darker side of it all, and I think Sabbath as a band always remained a dark force, but we weren't dismissing Christianity. Now we were showing our own confusion on what it was all about." And the track Solitude. Now, Solitude actually had a working title called Changing Phases. A delay effect was later added to Ozzy's vocals on the song as a means of kind of doubling the vocal track.
But it wasn't all dark music, it wasn't all dark. The sounds, I mean, there was a lot. We tried to experiment, all kinds of different things, but we never would stick to any one formula. Wouldn't go like verse, chorus, bridge, solo, verse, chorus, out. We'd go all over the place, Some of the time, it's only after the fact now, sometimes I occasionally with them on, I go, man, what were we on, man,
And for this track, Iommi actually played guitar, flute, and piano. And Iommi explains this by saying, quote, "I'm playing the flute on that song as well. I tried all sorts of things in the course of doing albums, even though I couldn't play them. And after being with Jethro Tull for that short stint, I thought I might try the flute. I did it only to a very amateurish extent, I must admit." Now, if you go and listen to Tony's playing on A Song for Jim, which is a tribute to their first manager, Jim Simpson, you will hear that actually, whether he says he's an amateur or not, he was actually pretty decent on the flute.
So, we were smashed out of our heads. We used to have these big chillums. It's a bloody blast from the past, isn't it? These great big chillums are the best hash you could ever imagine. We'd smoke these until the very last second that we had to go on stage. And so this one night we went on stage and he thought he was playing the flute, but the flute was down here on his chin. He was just blowing into the microphone. So all the audience was hearing was this on the amplified all over the PA. And he had his eyes closed. So Ozzy got this, we were all going, what the hell's he doing? And all we could hear was like he's blowing all through the PA. The flute nowhere near his lips. So Ozzy got this great big mirror out of the dressing room and dragged it on stage and put it right in front of him while he was doing this thing. So he finished what he thought was this flute solo and opened his eyes and seen himself and he was just, and we just had to stop playing. We just couldn't play. We just been laughing for about 20 minutes after that.
This song would later be covered by a band called Ulver on one of their records, and it is such a haunting, well-done cover. That's not to say the original is not amazing in its own right, and it's probably one of the best Black Sabbath tracks, in my opinion. Now, with Into the Void, there was a lot of problematic things going on with this song, to which Iommi says, quote, "We tried recording Into the Void in a couple of different studios because Bill just couldn't get it right. And whenever that happened, he would start believing that he wasn't even capable of playing the song. He'd just come up and say, 'To hell with it, I'm not doing this.' And there was one track like that on every album, and Into the Void was the most difficult one on Master of Reality."
But Massive Reality was quite a different thing. That took a lot longer. That's when we started getting to long time for us. It was going into weeks, and oh God, this is taking a bit long. We tried. There was one particular track that Bill couldn't get right. I think it was Under the Sun or something it was called. And we went to about 3 or 4 different studios because couldn't get the vibe in them days. I don't know how we got to that, but
Tony goes on to say that, quote, "For Ozzy, getting Geezer's lyrics right wouldn't always be easy. He certainly struggled on Into the Void. It has this slow bit, but then the riff where Ozzy comes in is very fast. Ozzy had to sing rocket engines burning fuel so fast, up into the night sky they blast. Quick words like that. And Geezer had written all the words out for him. Rocket, what the fuck, I can't sing this. And seeing him try it was hilarious." And so it's a little bit about the tracks on the record. There are obviously some instrumentals and other songs on the record, but these are the ones that had information. And just to talk a little bit more about the writing and recording and the band's thoughts kind of years later, looking back on this record, Iommi believes that the band might have gotten a little too comfortable, telling a Guitar World magazine in 92, saying, quote, during Master of Reality, we started getting more experimental and began taking too much time to record. Ultimately, I think it really confused us. Sometimes I think I'd really like to go back to the way we recorded the first 2 albums. I've always preferred just going into the studio and playing without spending a lot of time rehearsing or getting sounds. And Bill Ward says, quote, we'd seen a lot of the world by this point, thanks to our hectic touring schedule, and we had changed as people. That sort of thing is inevitable. And we were all trying to figure out who we were and how we fit into the world. I know that personally, I was still coming to terms with everything. I was still only 23 years old, and it would be another few years before I discovered myself and became more comfortable with who I was. He continues on saying, quote, but what we were doing in Master was questioning everything. We were in that phase of our life. We wrote about what was going on around the band. Sabbath had become observers of life, and that was to continue through the rest of the decade. Perhaps we'd been a little more influenced by stories that were fantasy beforehand, but not now. So let's talk about the album arts. Now, the album cover that we have all known for years and years of Master Reality actually wasn't the first cover that Black Sabbath had in mind. Another image that was first in line for Sabbath's next record in 1970, the band had actually bought a black and white drawing from German artist Peter Ruder. The plan was for him to come to London in January of 1971 and make a color version for the band's next album. Why it didn't actually become the cover for Master Reality is still kind of a mystery, though given that the band and label were trying to move away from overtly spooky and satanic imagery, this may be the reason why. So this time, rather than use a photo for the cover, Macmillan designed the Master Reality sleeve as a stark type treatment. It was created by a graphics design company that dubbed itself the Bloomsbury Group. To make it stand out, Bloomsbury embossed the bubbly lettering for the UK release so you could feel it with your fingers. But the US version was presented flat. In fact, pretty much all the Warner Brothers versions of those early Black Sabbath albums looked cheaper than their UK counterparts. Macmillan says he was disappointed to see that the label did a regular sleeve for Black Sabbath, his panorama shot, but was happy that the essence of it still worked. Black and purple were chosen as a theme to represent mourning colors, and there were many variants that occurred around the world, with the majority intending to make the band's name more readable beyond the straight embossing. After that initial press, there have been several variants worldwide of the color scheme, with red, orange, all purple lettering occasionally being used, but with the same basic design. According to Discogs.com, over 200 variants exist of the Master of Reality album cover. And speaking about that, Bill Ward has said, quote, I know that when we saw the album cover, we just loved it. We thought it was great. Purple and black. Everybody loves fucking black in our band. We saw it and we thought, yeah, that's great. And, Macmillan's contribution to Master of Reality was a 6-panel fold-out poster of Black Sabbath posing solemnly outside. As you can see on the screen here, the sky looks dark and eerie, and the whole image has an otherworldly vibe about it, similar to that pink sky and damaged look of the original Black Sabbath cover. And he says, quote, I think that band shot was really quite good. It had atmosphere and a feel to it. It was slightly unusual. In those days, especially in the UK, record company type photography was pretty straightforward down the line stuff. So the opportunity to do something a little bit more interesting with the atmosphere was a privilege, really, and very exciting. So to get that effect that you see in the photo, Macmillan used a twin-lens Mamiya Flex, which he described as a 6x6 camera, saying, quote, there is a slightly different effect to what I did on Black Sabbath, and to be honest, I can't quite remember what I did, but I was always experimenting trying to tell the story within a picture. I think we shot it in Black Park, but I can't quite remember. I do remember that the band was very cooperative, and I think the session was very quick because we knew what we were doing. And Macmillan says he wasn't disappointed that he didn't have a photo on the front of the album cover because he always enjoyed the challenge of doing something new. And the fact that the poster was such a unique prospect at the time, he says, quote, it was always, oh, well, why don't we make a little box thing with a poster in it? And he's describing the packaging of the record, continuing on saying, quote, of course, with the demise of the 12-inch vinyl, it's hard to imagine, but the idea of having a piece of artwork that's 36 by 12 gave us creatives on the visual side something to work with. Whereas when the CDs or the cassettes happened, it was just too small. The idea of being able to do a triple-size poster was great. And so just with all the printing differences that the album cover had, the actual records themselves had some printing differences, which we can get into right now. On the first North American editions of the album, several songs had subtitles given to segments, making it appear that there were more songs than were actually on the album. The intro of After Forever was given the title The Elegy. The coda of Children of the Grave was called The Haunting. The intro of Lord of This World was titled Step Up. And the intro of Into the Void was called Death Mask. Now, this treatment was also used in the North American editions of the previous two albums, and these pressings also incorrectly listed the album title as Masters of Reality. Subsequent editions corrected the album's title and removed the 3 of the 4 subtitles for all the tracks except for Elegy. The original Warner Brothers prints of the album had some strangeness with Death Mask and it being an individually labeled track, depending on which version you got. Death Mask had a running time as high as 3 minutes and 8 seconds, which is pretty arbitrary because it falls in the middle of vocals in the song. When it was corrected, the times were made even worse because Solitude was listed as 8 minutes and 8 seconds song and Into the Void at just 3 minutes and 8 seconds. Later prints still had the incorrect timings on the booklet, but the CD itself was properly spaced out. And on the original vinyl, the track Sweet Leaf was listed as Sweet Life. And some versions of the album report Embryo as a 5-minute song. This is actually incorrect because Embryo is a short instrumental right before the start of Children of the Grave. So that's a lot of really big inconsistencies. As you can see, this is just a symptom of rushing out a product, trying to ride off how well Paranoid's doing and to get something out. The record company is rushing all these little details and missing these little things like times and track names and stuff like that. It's unfortunate, but it's also interesting because of how many different versions of this album there are. And, I've put them all on the screen, so I'm sure you can see them. Now, another really interesting and unique thing that they did for this album is they did a promotion. And it was kind of lifted from a movie around the time, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. So Black Sabbath had randomly inserted 500 golden tickets into copies of Master of Reality. The ticket stated, quote, "In 10 words or less, explain why you love Black Sabbath's music." The prize of this would be that you would get to hang out with Black Sabbath for the day. Now, the winner ended up being writer Metal Mike Saunders, and the 10 words or less that won it for him was simply, quote, "Black Sabbath have discovered the secret of sound."
So you're considered the father of heavy metal. When's the first time you heard the term?
I've never classed ourselves as heavy metal. We've always been heavy rock in my mind. And the first time I heard heavy metal was when I went back to England one time. And I'm doing this interview and this guy said, "Oh, about heavy metal." I went, "What?" He said, "You heavy metal." And I said, "What's that?"
Any magazine writer, deserves credit for coining the term as a descriptive license plate for this music. It would be Heavy Metal Mike Saunders.
November 1970. The author, Mike Saunders, an 18-year-old University of Arkansas student who wrote record reviews for grocery money. The album, Humble Pie's As Safe as Yesterday Is. It's the first time heavy metal was used in print to describe hard music. What the term meant and which bands it applied to, no one was exactly sure. either then or now.
Master of Reality was released on August 6, 1971 by Vertigo Records. The album peaked at number 5 on the UK album charts and number 8 on the US Billboard 200. Sabbath also undertook their most ambitious tour to date, going on the road for an astonishing 14 months, including a 22-date sold-out trek around the UK in the spring of 1972. So like I mentioned earlier, this is a time where the band really starts kind of getting into drugs and alcohol. So there are some stories from the road or around on the internet that I've tried to compile here. One of them is from Rick Wakeman, the keyboard player of Yes. And he says, quote, I was a serious drinker, as were all of Sabbath, so we got on like a house fire. They had a seat on their private plane, so I traveled with them. You literally couldn't move for booze. Ozzy was putting away as much as me, which was as much as humanly possible. So obviously the guys were drinking pretty hard, flying on private jets. Things were going pretty darn well for them. Now, also around this time, Tony Iommi talks about the first time he tried cocaine. And he says, quote, "The first time I tried coke was at the LA Forum in 1971. I said to one of the crew, I feel really tired tonight. And he said, why don't you have a line? It'll perk you up. I'd been around it for a while, but I'd never taken it. I only had a little bit, one line, but it felt great." And kind of continuing on with that sentiment, Tony says, the success happened so quickly, but we just went along with it. The only thing that messed up our heads was the drugs. To which Bill Ward also talks about it. He says, quote, we were getting into coke big time. Uppers, downers, quaaludes, whatever you like. It got to the stage where you come up with ideas and forget them because you were just so out of it. And so that is the story of the Master of Reality. The tour for Master of Reality would become a life-changing time for the band. Drugs and alcohol started seeping into the everyday lives of the members, and so this would also be a time where a lot of the band's issues with those things would cause the beginning of the end for the lineup as we know it. But as they say,
this is where the fun begins.